How did a series of small economic protests suddenly push Iran to the edge of losing control over its own streets? And more importantly, what happens when fear, the regime's most powerful weapon, starts to fail? What began in late December as scattered demonstrations over inflation and currency collapse quickly crossed a point of no return. According to reports circulating at the start of January, protests were recorded in more than 100 cities and towns across Iran within days. This was no longer an isolated urban phenomenon limited to Tehran. Provincial towns, border regions, and long-neglected communities joined in almost simultaneously, signaling a nationwide breakdown of patience rather than a coordinated political campaign. At first glance, the trigger appeared purely economic. The Iranian rial had plunged sharply after government decisions to favor regime-linked exporters, leaving private businesses exposed and household purchasing power shattered. Bread prices surged, fuel costs climbed, savings evaporated. For millions of Iranians already living on the edge, daily survival became uncertain. Analysts noted that unlike earlier protest waves driven by political slogans, these demonstrations were fueled by immediate material desperation. Rent unpaid shops, closed debts mounting. Yet something deeper shifted when security forces, traditionally the regime's first line of defense, began showing visible hesitation. Verified footage from early January showed police units standing aside, clapping, or even gesturing support as protesters marched past. This moment mattered more than any slogan. In authoritarian systems, protests remain manageable as long as enforcement holds. The moment enforcement wavers, the balance of power changes psychologically, even if not yet militarily. Western observers compared this phase to historical tipping points in late Cold War Eastern Europe, when economic grievance eroded loyalty faster than ideology. Reuters and BBC reporting at the time highlighted that Iran's internal security apparatus was under unprecedented strain, forced to respond simultaneously across dozens of locations rather than concentrating force in a single hotspot. This stretched response capacity reduced deterrence and emboldened crowds elsewhere, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Meanwhile, international context added pressure. With Donald Trump serving as U.S. president, Washington's posture toward Tehran remained openly confrontational. Sanctions enforcement stayed tight, limiting the regime's fiscal room to calm unrest through subsidies or emergency spending. Defense analysts writing for outlets such as Defense News and Military Watch magazine argued that Iran's leadership faced a narrowing set of options: compromise economically and risk elite backlash, or repress violently and risk mass defection. Crucially, these protests were not driven by organized opposition leaders or foreign-backed networks, despite regime claims. Instead, interviews conducted by international media described ordinary shop owners, parents, and workers who had never protested before. Many openly acknowledged fear, but also admitted that fear had lost its utility when survival itself was at stake. As one protester told a foreign broadcaster, life under constant inflation already felt like a slow death. This distinction matters strategically. NATO analysts watching the situation noted that movements rooted in economic collapse are harder to neutralize than ideological uprisings. They lack centralized leadership, but gain resilience from sheer numbers and shared lived experience. No arrests can remove hunger from the streets. Yet even at this early stage, warning signs were clear. The regime's tolerance threshold was shrinking. Security reinforcements were redeployed from other duties. State media rhetoric hardened. What appeared initially as hesitation risked giving way to a brutal reassertion of control. Meanwhile, as protests spread faster than anticipated, the question shifted from whether unrest could be contained to how far the regime was willing to go to restore fear, and whether fear would still work when confronted by empty stomachs and collapsing livelihoods. What does it mean when entire cities begin slipping from central control, not through armed rebellion, but through collective defiance? And could these localized cracks signal something far more dangerous for the Iranian state? As protests intensified, the most alarming development for Tehran was not their size, but their geography. Border cities and peripheral regions, long treated as politically manageable through neglect, suddenly emerged as focal points of resistance. In several cases, demonstrations escalated beyond marches into direct challenges to state authority, exposing vulnerabilities the regime had long assumed were secure. In early January, multiple border towns reported scenes that would have been unthinkable only weeks earlier. Government buildings were overrun, symbols of the Islamic Republic were vandalized, and security forces either withdrew or refused to intervene. Importantly, looting was largely absent. Analysts noted this detail as significant. The protests were not devolving into chaos, but instead carried a clear political message: rejection of the system itself, rather than opportunistic violence. Western media coverage emphasized that border regions hold outsized strategic value. These areas are critical for trade routes, energy transit, and internal security coordination. Losing effective control, even temporarily, undermines the image of omnipresence that authoritarian regimes rely upon. As BBC correspondents observed, once a city experiences even a brief period without visible regime enforcement, the psychological barrier to resistance collapses elsewhere. Ethnic and regional dynamics further complicated the situation. Several of the most active cities were home to minority populations historically marginalized by Tehran. While the protests were not ethnically driven, resentment over economic neglect amplified participation. Experts writing for Al Jazeera cautioned that this convergence, economic despair layered onto long-standing regional grievances, creates a multiplier effect that is difficult to reverse through force alone. Meanwhile, Iranian state media attempted to downplay events, referring to isolated disturbances. Yet satellite imagery, open-source intelligence, and eyewitness videos contradicted these claims. According to assessments cited by Reuters, the regime was forced to redeploy internal security units from quieter provinces, leaving other areas exposed. This reactive posture marked a departure from Iran's traditionally centralized control model. From a NATO and U.S. strategic perspective, these developments raised immediate concerns. Analysts in Washington noted that instability along Iran's borders complicates regional security calculations, particularly amid ongoing tensions involving energy supply chains and maritime routes. With Ukraine continuing to strike Russian energy infrastructure, tightening global energy markets, Iran's ability to project stability became increasingly relevant to Western planning. At the same time, Tehran's leadership faced an internal dilemma. A full military crackdown risked transforming protests into sustained insurgency, especially in terrain favorable to local resistance. Yet restraint risked normalizing defiance. Historical parallels drawn by Western scholars compared this moment to early phases of state erosion when authority fades unevenly rather than collapsing all at once. Still, the regime had not yet exhausted its most familiar tool force. Security commanders began signaling a shift toward harsher measures, framing unrest as foreign-instigated sabotage rather than domestic crisis. This rhetorical shift foreshadowed a more violent Phase 1 that would test whether the loyalty fractures already visible could be repaired or whether they would widen under pressure. Yet as cities slipped from control without firing a shot, one question lingered among observers. If authority could evaporate this quickly in the periphery, what might happen when the confrontation reached the core? What followed next, analysts warned, would determine whether Iran's unrest remained episodic or crossed into irreversible territory. When the first signs of hesitation appeared inside Iran's security forces, many analysts asked a dangerous question. Was loyalty cracking or merely bending under pressure? And if the men tasked with enforcing order began to doubt their mission, who would ultimately carry out the regime's will? As protests expanded, evidence mounted that Iran's internal security apparatus was under unprecedented strain. In multiple cities, police units failed to disperse crowds, arrived late, or stood passively as demonstrations unfolded. In some cases, officers were filmed signaling sympathy or quietly stepping aside. These were not isolated incidents of indiscipline. They reflected a deeper morale problem rooted in the same economic hardships affecting the broader population. Security personnel are not insulated from inflation. Their salaries had lost value just as rapidly as those of the civilians they were ordered to confront. Western analysts cited by Reuters noted that when enforcement officers face the same shortages and rising prices as protesters, the psychological distance between order and disorder collapses. Loyalty becomes transactional, and transactions fail when the state can no longer pay. Yet the regime's response was not reconciliation. Instead, Tehran doubled down. Command structures tightened. Revolutionary Guard units were increasingly deployed to backfill wavering police forces. The messaging shifted sharply from tolerance to intimidation. Protesters were no longer described as citizens with grievances, but as rioters and enemy mercenaries, language historically used to justify lethal force. This transition marked a critical turning point. According to reporting by BBC and Al Jazeera, security forces were given expanded authority, including the use of live ammunition in certain areas. Hospitals became contested spaces with reports of wounded protesters being detained or removed by authorities. Funerals were restricted or banned outright, acknowledging perhaps unintentionally that collective mourning had become a catalyst for further unrest. From a strategic standpoint, Western defense experts warned that such measures risked accelerating defection rather than preventing it. Historical research referenced in defense news highlights that indiscriminate repression often forces security personnel to choose sides sooner rather than later. Once officers are ordered to act against their own communities or conceal civilian deaths, the cost of obedience rises sharply. Meanwhile, the international environment amplified these internal tensions. With Donald Trump maintaining pressure on Iran through sanctions and diplomatic isolation, Tehran lacked external relief options. Unlike past crises, there was no realistic prospect of rapid economic stabilization through foreign capital or oil revenue expansion. Military analysts observed that the regime's traditional strategy, weather unrest until conditions improve, was no longer viable. This dynamic resonated beyond Iran. NATO planners monitored the situation closely, particularly given simultaneous disruptions to global energy infrastructure caused by Ukraine's ongoing strikes against Russian refineries and power facilities. Energy market volatility increased the strategic importance of Iranian stability, even as Iran itself struggled to maintain internal cohesion. As force replaced hesitation, the question shifted again. Would harsher repression restore obedience within the ranks, or expose fractures too deep to mend? Reports suggested that some units complied out of fear rather than conviction, a fragile foundation for sustained control. Yet even as the regime hardened its stance, cracks remained visible. Not every order was carried out. Not every crowd dispersed. The line between enforcer and protester blurred in ways Tehran could neither fully acknowledge nor easily reverse. Meanwhile, as loyalty wavered on the streets, another fracture emerged at the very top inside Iran's leadership itself. How does a regime respond when its own words begin to expose its weakness? And what happens when the leadership's explanations no longer match what people see outside their windows? As unrest spread, Iran's top leadership finally broke its relative silence, and in doing so revealed a striking internal disconnect. In his first major public remarks since the protests escalated nationwide, The Supreme Leader framed the crisis not as an economic collapse or governance failure, but as a foreign conspiracy. Currency instability, he argued, was the work of external enemies, and protests were driven by incited mercenaries, rather than domestic frustration. This narrative was familiar, yet increasingly unconvincing. Western analysts noted that blaming external actors may rally loyalists, but it does little to address empty markets or unpaid wages. Reuters and BBC assessments highlighted that such rhetoric often signals that leadership has run out of practical solutions and is reverting to ideological reflexes. When survival issues dominate daily life, abstract enemies lose persuasive power. What deepened the problem was the lack of message discipline at the top. While the Supreme Leader emphasized foreign sabotage, other senior officials adopted a sharply different tone, one that many Iranians interpreted as accusatory. Public statements suggested citizens themselves were responsible for hoarding instability or mismanagement of expectations. This contradiction mattered. Instead of projecting unity, the leadership appeared fragmented, unsure whether to intimidate, blame, or placate. From a strategic communications perspective, this split was dangerous. Authoritarian systems rely on a single coherent narrative to sustain legitimacy under stress. Analysts cited by Al Jazeera noted that once messaging fractures, it signals to both citizens and security forces that confidence at the top is eroding. Doubt spreads downward quickly. Symbolism amplified the disconnect. Across several cities, posters and murals celebrating regime icons were burned or defaced. These acts were not random vandalism, but deliberate rejection of state mythology. For years, such symbols had been treated as untouchable. Their destruction suggested that fear once internalized was now openly challenged. Western scholars compared this moment to symbolic breaks seen in other late-stage authoritarian crises, where public defiance targets not institutions but the narratives that justify them. Meanwhile, the regime attempted limited economic concessions. Temporary cash assistance was announced, framed as relief for struggling households. Yet the scale was modest and implementation uneven. According to international reporting, many eligible families either received nothing or dismissed the payments as insufficient against soaring prices. The gesture appeared more tactical than transformative, an attempt to buy time rather than restore trust. From the US and NATO perspective, these leadership contradictions carried broader implications. Stability in Iran affects regional energy flows, maritime security, and strategic calculations, at a time when global markets are already strained by the war in Ukraine. As Ukraine continues targeting Russian energy infrastructure, volatility elsewhere compounds Western concerns. Analysts in Washington warned that a mismanaged Iranian crisis could ripple outward faster than policymakers anticipate. Crucially, leadership rhetoric also shaped security behavior. Orders to put rioters in their place provided moral cover for escalation, while mixed messaging left room for selective enforcement. Some units acted decisively. Others hesitated, uncertain which narrative would prevail tomorrow. The result was an unstable equilibrium, too much force to restore calm, too little coherence to regain legitimacy. And as the leadership argued among itself, events on the ground moved faster than speeches could follow. Yet words alone would not define the next phase. What unfolded in the streets, hospitals, and homes of grieving families would push the crisis into far darker territory. What followed next, analysts warned, would harden public resolve in ways no speech could undo. How does a government respond when fear itself becomes ineffective? And what happens when repression fuels the very resistance it was meant to suppress? In the days following leadership statements, Iranian security forces escalated operations with a brutality that shocked international observers. Reports confirmed that protesters were being targeted in hospitals during funerals and even inside their homes. Families of the deceased were pressured into signing declarations falsely labeling their loved ones as members of the Revolutionary Guard, with burial rites contingent on compliance. This tactic, widely reported by BBC and Al Jazeera correspondents, aimed to control mourning and prevent funerals from becoming mobilizing events. Instead, it intensified public anger. Violence erupted in multiple cities, most notably in towns previously thought quiet. In Malakshari, crowds attacked government-owned buildings, causing significant property damage, yet leaving offices unlooted. Analysts interpreted this as a signal the movement was not about opportunism, but about rejecting the regime's authority outright. Western military experts noted that such selective targeting is characteristic of populations who have lost trust in institutional legitimacy but retain social cohesion. Meanwhile, Iran's security forces faced a paradox. Units ordered to suppress demonstrations were themselves divided. Defections and refusals to engage were reported, creating operational inconsistencies. International observers, including experts from Defense News, emphasized that when enforcement loyalty falters, authoritarian regimes face heightened risks of escalation spiraling beyond control. The streets became both a battlefield and a stage for moral contestation, where force and defiance interacted in real time. Economic despair compounded the unrest. Inflation remained rampant, prices for basic goods soared, and employment opportunities dwindled. Citizens interviewed by international media described lives where bread, fuel, and rent dictated the limits of survival. Such desperation underpinned what analysts called a revolution of necessity, where continued acquiescence was no longer viable. Citizens' calculus had shifted. Fear could no longer outweigh immediate needs. From a strategic perspective, NATO and U.S. intelligence tracked these developments closely. The destabilization along Iran's borders had potential regional ramifications. Coupled with ongoing Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, global energy supply chains faced compounded risks. Analysts in Washington observed that a prolonged Iranian crisis could indirectly affect European energy security, necessitating contingency planning. Yet despite the harsh repression, the Iranian public persisted. Social media, encrypted messaging platforms, and eyewitness video circulated evidence of both protests and abuses. This transparency further weakened the regime's narrative and emboldened new participants. Experts noted that the combination of economic suffering, moral outrage, and visible state violence creates a potent feedback loop. Each act of repression intensifies resistance. As nights filled with chants and marches continued, the question remained: how far would the regime go to restore obedience, and how far would ordinary citizens push back? Historical comparisons with other authoritarian collapses suggested that once funerals and daily life become politicized, the momentum rarely reverses without either genuine reform or a catastrophic crackdown. Yet, as streets hardened and resolve solidified, one reality became clear: this was no longer a protest about bread alone. It had transformed into a challenge to the very legitimacy of the state. Meanwhile, observers began tracking how ordinary survival was becoming intertwined with political rebellion, setting the stage for an existential confrontation. What drives a society to risk everything in the streets when survival itself hangs in the balance? And could Iran's ongoing unrest evolve into a historic turning point in the nation's governance? By mid-January, the protests had matured into an existential struggle. Citizens were no longer marching merely for economic relief. They were confronting decades of systemic oppression, corruption, and failed governance. Interviews with protesters conducted anonymously for safety revealed a shared sentiment: life under chronic inflation, unemployment, and scarcity had become intolerable. As one mother of two explained, the decision to join demonstrations was framed as a matter of survival. When life and death no longer differentiate between fear and action, bravery emerges not from ideology, but necessity. The protest's intensity was magnified by a combination of geographic spread, social cohesion, and visible government overreach. Cities previously considered peripheries became epicenters as local populations organized to resist not only through presence, but through symbolic acts, burning regime symbols, occupying public spaces, and refusing to comply with curfew orders. Western analysts highlighted that this pattern reflects the early stages of a movement that blends civil disobedience with elements of insurgency, a structure that is resilient to sporadic repression. Meanwhile, Tehran's forces struggled to contain the movement. Defections among police and paramilitary units persisted. Analysts cited by Defense News noted that when enforcement personnel sympathize with protesters or refuse engagement, the operational burden shifts to elite units stretching resources and increasing the risk of errors or indiscriminate violence. This dynamic can accelerate the erosion of central authority. International context remained critical. With Ukraine continuing precision strikes against Russian energy infrastructure, global energy volatility created strategic pressure points. NATO and U.S. officials monitored Iranian unrest, closely recognizing that instability in Tehran could indirectly impact European energy supply and influence regional alliances. The combination of domestic unrest and external geopolitical stressors left the regime with limited options. Economic desperation remained the primary motivator, but ideological components had emerged. Citizens expressed rejection of both the symbols and agents of the Islamic Republic, demonstrating that protest motivations had evolved beyond immediate material concerns. Al Jazeera and BBC reports emphasized that the regime's inability to reconcile its narrative with lived reality eroded legitimacy. Temporary economic concessions, such as small cash allowances, failed to pacify the population, instead reinforcing perceptions of cynicism and mismanagement. As streets remained filled with chants, marches, and public gatherings, observers in the West drew parallels with historical transitions in authoritarian contexts, noting that once populations crossed the threshold from fear to active defiance, restoration of order becomes progressively more difficult without fundamental political reform. Ultimately, Iran's ongoing unrest represented not just an economic crisis, but a profound challenge to state authority. Citizens were now confronting the limits of fear, governance, and coercion, setting the stage for an uncertain future. The regime faced an existential choice: escalate repression at potentially catastrophic cost, or negotiate reforms under intense internal and international scrutiny. What will unfold in the coming weeks may determine not only Iran's internal trajectory, but the regional balance of power, forcing policymakers in NATO and Washington to weigh how far the unrest could ripple across borders, affecting security, energy, and diplomacy in the wider Middle East.